Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. All right, got my audio seems okay. I always think it's fun to do I take the Microsoft Flight Sim audio and kind of slowly dial it back as I start the stream. I always feel a little bit like a DJ, kind of the extent of my DJ ability. All right, let's dive in here. So today we're talking about emergency operations. I'll do my sort of normal intro script and then we'll dive into the main content today. So, hi and welcome. My name is Jules. I'm a real life CFI, and the goal of these lessons is to work through all of the topics that you would cover on your way to getting your private pilot's license. So, this is starting from maybe never having flown before or minimal experience, all the way through getting a license that lets you fly anywhere in the country, day or night, as long as you're flying visual flight rules. So, you have to be able to see the horizon as you're flying. The goal here is to cover all the key topics, but it's good to keep in mind that the only real way to learn to fly is to work one-on-one with your own CFI. So I'm hoping that these lessons maybe give you some interesting ideas or some ways to think about things for your own sim flying, or if you're already a pilot for your own flying. But if you're interested in flying in the real world, and I hope you are, the best thing to do is to go to your local airport and find a CFI or a flight school or a flying club and work with them on either setting up the lessons you want to do or at least getting a demo flight just to go and try flying the airplane, see if you like the feeling of flying in the air. Even if you're not sure that you want to do a full set of lessons, either expense-wise or just time availability in your life-wise, a demo flight is a really, really great experience, especially if you've only ever done sim flying before. The feeling of flying through the air is really indescribable, but I always feel so silly describing it because I'm like, it feels like you're flying, but it really does. It feels like you're, kind of flying through the air, which I think is just an amazing feeling. Lessons that we're going to cover do build on each other, so this is lesson 15, but I will be attentive to folks just joining for a periodic lesson here or there. So if you're just tuning in for one a week or so, totally fine. Hopefully you'll still be able to pick up some useful things. The older lessons are all on YouTube currently, so if you want to watch any of those, that's the place to go check out. If you have any questions during the live stream, you're welcome to post in the Twitch chat and I'll try and answer. But if you have anything that comes up after the live stream, I just posted the Discord link in the chat. And so the YouTube videos are on that YouTube link, and then the Discord is for questions or feedback afterwards. I'll also post the add-ons that I'm using, in case that's useful. So importantly, that first add-on on the list is the working title GNS fix, which I have found to be super valuable. Otherwise, the GNS 530 that comes in the Microsoft Flight Sim plane isn't implemented correctly, and so one, it doesn't translate to a real plane, which is sort of a bummer, but also if you're like me and have some experience with the GNS 530, you may get lost among the pages, as I was doing. Last thing I'll mention, we have our lesson 16 coming up on Monday. That is the lesson for a pre-solo knowledge test, pre-solo paperwork, and that sort of thing. I mentioned this a couple of days ago, but we'll essentially use that lesson as a chance to cover anything that is important to know pre-solo and sort of fell through the cracks of the way these lesson plans were structured before. Those of you who have tuned in for a handful of lessons know that I've been working to improve the lessons as I go, maybe splitting some here or there, taking concepts from one and moving it to another. So there's a handful of topics that came up where I sort of went, oh, that would be really good to talk about pre-solo, but it didn't really make sense for how the lessons are currently structured. So anyway, so the pre-solo one should be kind of a fun catch-all. We'll also talk about some of the, we'll briefly talk about the required paperwork for pre-solo, just like here's the things to make sure you have lined up. But we'll then also talk about the pre-solo knowledge test, what's required for that, and what some of that might look like for you as you're going into your solo. I had no follow-up from the last flight. We were off yesterday. I was out doing a interview actually, so I went for a flight, which had a couple of really interesting weather things that occurred that I'll talk a little bit about later. I might talk about them in just a moment here actually, because they were kind of good examples of things that we've talked about here, of considerations to be making and what certain flight conditions might look like. But I'll talk about that just a little bit more. All right, I think that's all before we dive in. Any questions? Do a slow drink of water here while folks type anything they got. So I'll tell the brief story of what the weather situation was yesterday. So essentially we had, so let me switch back here. One thing you can see is it's foggy at Palo Alto right now, which is sort of not unusual for the Bay Area this time of year. It's not actually this foggy anymore, so the game's a little bit outdated. It burned off pretty quick today, but it was sort of interesting to see that. So let me pull up real quick and I'll show you what we were looking at yesterday. So here is I took a screenshot of the weather. Oh, I don't know what's up with that. Okay, let's do this. I think that'll work, yeah. So I took a screenshot of the weather, and so we've talked about already the terminal area aerodrome forecast. So that's that TAF, and so you can see the TAF here. And I grabbed a picture of the flight was at San Carlos, and the TAF I was looking at then was the SFO TAF, the nearest airport that has a TAF that comes out. And what I wanted to point out here is oops, I forgot my pencil. Excuse me. Grab that out. So what I wanted to point out here was the TAF for the time period that I was going to be flying. So let me underline real quick and let's talk about this. Oops. Let's talk about this guy right here. I know there's a way to draw on this. There we go. That one. So just above that line. So the reason that this is an interesting TAF is it includes this. Okay, my Let's View, the tool I use for sharing my screen is changing sizes on me in real time, which is pretty funny. That's all right, we'll just make this work. So if you read this TAF through, we have at the beginning, it says just the normal sort of what time the TAF is valid for. SFO is a 30-hour TAF. Most of them are 24 hours, but that's what this 2612 means. It's valid from UTC hour 12 on the 26th day to the 27th day, UTC 18th hour. The expected winds, which were pretty strong, so 16 knots at 020 is not light winds, but doable depending on the heading of the runway. And so that's where that, crosswind calculation comes into effect. But the more interesting piece of here, and what really ended up being we ended up rescheduling our interview flight for later in the afternoon because of it, which was these reports of expected wind shear at 2,000 feet. So that's WS020, so 2,000 feet above the ground. I'm sorry, MSL, so above sea level. And they're expecting the wind to shift to 040 at 45 knots. So 45 knots at 2,000 feet above the ground, coming from 16 knots at the surface. So they're expecting there to be a 30-knot wind shift as you cross above 2,000 feet. And so what I thought was interesting about this is the exact scenario we had talked about with wind shear considerations on approach to landing. So if I had gone out to do this flight in the morning, what I was thinking through is, and again, we decided not to for a couple other reasons I'll talk about in about 2 seconds. But thinking about this, if I'm coming in to land and I know that there's a possibility of a 30-knot, maybe more, maybe less, but maybe more if the forecasts are off, wind shear, if I'm coming in to land at 60 knots and suddenly I lose 30 knots of that, I'm below my stalling speed and I would stall my aircraft as I'm coming in to land. And so making sure that the speed is high enough that even with this loss of wind shear, we'd still be able to land meant that our approach speed for landing would have to be really pretty fast. And so then all of a sudden you have to do additional calculations on, okay, how much runway do I need? Let's say that I don't experience that wind shear. All of a sudden I'm coming in to land, maybe 30 knots faster. Probably wouldn't use exactly that, but some amount faster. If I come in with that much speed, how much am I going to float? And if I'm floating that much, how much runway do I need to use? So there's this whole sort of set of calculations related to accounting for this potential for severe wind shear. So sort of 2 other things that really impacted the decision, the go, no-go decision yesterday. One of them was the AirMet for moderate turbulence. And so we talked a little bit about AirMets also when we looked at our weather briefing. And so that AirMet for turbulence is essentially the weather forecast that a particular region of the country, actually I can try and pull up a current AirMet. The one from yesterday is no longer around, but we can probably find a new one. So if we go in here, let's see what we got. A lot of stuff going on. Okay, so here's this orange one for ForeFlight is how it shows up. Okay, so this is sort of similar to what we saw yesterday. Oops, sorry, let me go back here. That's why Okay, so this is sort of similar to what we were seeing yesterday in the weather forecast. And so what I did is I clicked on this orange one. This would also show up in your pre-flight weather briefing. And it says that there's turbulence from the surface to 10,000 feet MSL, and that severity is moderate. And so that doesn't necessarily mean, this is just a forecast, it doesn't mean that there is going to be moderate turbulence on your flight, but it's an indication that there might be moderate turbulence on your flight. And so what we had yesterday was this forecasted AirMet for quite a large region. But the really important thing is we have this low-level wind shear forecast. We have this AirMet for turbulence, but then we also had these PIREPs. So on ForeFlight, they show up as these little eyes. But you also would get this as part of your standard weather brief. And those PIREPs had information that confirmed that the forecasted conditions were occurring currently in the area. And not only were they currently occurring currently in the area, but they were basically as bad as forecasted. Sometimes you would get PIREPs that would say, yes, this is forecasted, but you might get a PIREP that says there's no turbulence. So, it would say, yes, we saw the forecast for turbulence, but maybe over the Woodside VOR down here, maybe you get a forecast, or you have a PIREP that says we didn't experience any turbulence, even though it's a forecast of turbulence. What we had yesterday instead was confirmation that all of these conditions existed, and they existed pretty strongly. And so now we're thinking, okay, well, if we're going to go up for a flight as kind of an interview, and we have this moderate turbulence, which means aircraft stays, so each of the levels of turbulence have a specific definition. Moderate turbulence would mean the aircraft stays in positive control the whole time, but you're straining against your seatbelt as you're getting bumped around. And so, me and the flight instructor I was going with, then we would have been through this entire flight getting bumped into the seatbelt, and kind of the plane would have been getting tossed around. And you can do that. You fly below maneuvering speed like we talked about. You make sure that the strain on the wings from that load factor of bumping isn't a concern. And you do that by staying below maneuvering speed. But it's pretty hard to demonstrate anything all that meaningful if the whole time you're just focused on keeping the plane at the correct attitude and dealing with this moderate turbulence. So we decided to postpone to the afternoon. Forecasts are much better, and had actually a really nice flight. So anyway, kind of an interesting example from the conversations and topics we've been talking about. I thought I would call out to what that looked like. Okay, so let's dive into today's lesson. One thing I'll point out, on my iPad, I've been slowly adding in layers as we've talked about more things. So hopefully this isn't getting to be overwhelming. This would be sort of what I would say is my normal flying view. What it gives me is it gives me all of the airspace. So I have these purple, the blue lines, the dotted blue for Delta airspace, blue for the Bravo, this kind of magenta for Charlie airspace. I also have the NOTAMs and TFRs are all on there. Actually, this is probably a NOTAM. Yeah. But it would show me all my TFRs in different places. And then I also have the PIREPs so that I can see if there's any reports of certain things going on, like at SFO. An aircraft 787 reported that the ceiling was broken at 600 feet. So that's really helpful to know. Or at Palo Alto, we can see what they're saying too. Actually, let's look at the Palo Alto one because this is where we are going to be flying. Let's see if I can click on that. Okay, so this is saying that the bases are at 600 and the tops are at 800. So if we wanted to climb out through here, we would need an instrument rating because we couldn't depart from the airport with a ceiling of 600. We can't even get up to the traffic pattern altitude, so we wouldn't be able to go around the traffic. We'll change the weather if we want to go flying today. But okay, so enough rambling there. Hopefully that was interesting and not just chit chatty. The lesson for today is all about emergency operations, so let's dive into the key content here. Objective is to develop knowledge of abnormal and emergency procedures for the training aircraft in use, including all ACS risk management and skill tasks. This references the AFH Chapter 18. This is emergency procedures. This is the same chapter that we referenced yesterday. They have just additional procedures in there that you should be aware of. The AIM Chapter 6, which is all about emergency procedures, especially the squawk codes. We'll talk a little bit about that. So that's a little bit more about emergency procedures relative to ATC. There's the AFH and the POH, which is your official guidance on what to do in a given emergency. And most of our lesson today will actually be looking at the POH together. And last but not least, the Private Pilot ACS Section 9. This is a great example of, before you go for your check ride, you should go through the whole ACS and make sure that you understand every single item in there. Actually, if we haven't pulled this up yet, this is a good time to look at this together. So if I go into my, I am sure I have this in here somewhere, but let's see if I have the Private Pilot one. I did all of my Private Pilot check ride work with without using ForeFlight all that much. I started using it more towards the end, but I really wanted to do my core training without it. So here's the private pilot ACS. Let's jump to the emergency operations. Okay, so this is in the private pilot ACS section 9, and it has the specific task you're required to do. So in this case, it's talking about emergency descent. And then it has the the objective, of course, but then also knowledge, risk management, and skills. And so you've heard some of this language in the objectives and the lesson plans, and that is a direct call out to the knowledge, risk, and skills of the ACS. So knowledge is things that you're expected to understand and be able to explain. Risk management is understanding of things that can go wrong and what you might need to do about them, either to mitigate or to address. And the last section, skills, is about the actual thing you're expected to demonstrate. We'll talk today about emergency descents. That's one of the ones. Another one would be the emergency approach and landing. So this is what we worked on yesterday. And the last one on here, systems and equipment. There's a couple more things that we'll talk about today as well, which is the emergency equipment survival gear. But a big part of today is going to be systems and equipment malfunctions. And you can see how they have this list of a bunch of different types of emergencies that could occur. And then your expectation is to be able to demonstrate the appropriate action for the emergency based on whatever the examiner asks you to do, or the evaluator, I guess they call it. So today we're going to be covering these ones. We won't talk very much about the vacuum pressure failure or pedostatic failure. We'll talk more about that in a future lesson. Today we're focused more on the electrical system and other inoperative equipment. Okay, so this is the ACS. If you haven't seen it before you go to your check ride, and honestly, you could probably start going through it at this point if you'd like, to understand what's expected of you on the final test. But also, these are all the things that we've been covering. So this is where the material for this lesson plans is based around making sure that you are able to, one, to fly safely and proficiently. This is the prepared to be pilot in command, but then you're also making sure that you're prepared to pass the test, covering all these different items. All right, let me flip back to the 172 SP POH section 3. This lesson builds on emergency landings, unsurprisingly. The schedule for today is 1.5 hours on the ground, and then we'll do flight practice as necessary. For today, the intent is that we will spend most of our time in the POH, and then we'll hop over to the sim and sort of look at some things in the plane and talk about the procedures in sort of slow motion. We won't likely go up and fly. I can't think of any reason that we would. But maybe if something comes up it's useful to show, we can talk about it. But the real goal today is sort of a knowledge ground session about these different systems. All right, let's dive into the lesson elements. So talk about FAR 91.3. We talked about this yesterday, but this is an important one to call back to. We're going to talk about what an emergency is and when you should declare one. Just to note that we're going to cover instrument failures later. We'll talk about emergencies related to fire, emergencies related to failure, emergencies related to unsafe conditions, and then emergency equipment survival gear, as well as squawk codes. And then we'll, of course, conclude with some common errors. All right, if there are no questions, then I will dive in here. So let's start at the top with the PIC responsibility and authority. This is the same thing we looked at yesterday. So just a reminder that this is one of the first regulations in Part 91. And it specifically says that the pilot in command of an aircraft is directly responsible for and the final authority to the operation of the aircraft. So a large part of my goal as a CFI is to make sure that you're prepared to be PIC of the aircraft that you're going to be flying. That also then includes making sure that you're making good go, no-go decisions, that you can think through those sorts of things. Part of the reason that we talked about my experience from yesterday is that that's an example of that sort of PIC aeronautical decision making. How do you process through what the weather is going to be like, how you're going to account for that, and whether or not it's a good idea to go flying. The second piece of that, though, which relates more to emergencies, is in an in-flight emergency requiring immediate action, the pilot in command may deviate from any other rule of this part to the extent required to meet that emergency. So by the time you get your private pilot, you'll know all the different FARs, you'll have those memorized, and if you have an emergency that occurs and you need to break another rule, that is okay. As long as it's required to meet the emergency, then you can break that rule. Okay, what is an emergency? When should you declare one? So this is something that when I was working through my private pilot, I hadn't really thought about what constitutes an emergency. Like, we know the emergency procedures, and if you have a problem like your wingtip catches on fire, for instance, we'll talk about that emergency later today, but let's say that you have a wingtip fire. It's pretty obvious that that's an emergency, and you are going to do your emergency checklist, and then you're going to get back to a place where you can go get everything checked out. So some of them are a little bit more clear, but knowing when to declare an emergency isn't something I had thought much about. And so it's important for me it's important to me that we talk about it a little bit more at this point in training, because declaring an emergency isn't something that you should have to like kind of debate about at the time. You want to have a definition that you're ready to use, apply the definition, and then if it fits the definition of an emergency, you should go for it. So the short version is you should declare an emergency when the outcome of the flight is in doubt. So a more nuanced one that came up actually in the Bay Area a little while ago, there was a airplane that went out flying, and they noticed while they were flying that the fuel was leaking from the tanks. And so there wasn't a fire, the plane was still running just fine, but there was fuel leaking out of the tanks that they saw just kind of, I think it was running down back the wing or something like that. And so they knew that they were losing fuel, but they had no way of knowing how much fuel they had lost. They had the fuel gauges, but we've already talked about how trusting the fuel gauges isn't necessarily a good idea. They were also on a plane that used float type fuel gauges, not electrical fuel gauges. And so just even less precise in some ways. But in any case, because they didn't know the rate at which the fuel was going away, they didn't know how much longer they were going to be able to fly. And so this would be a moment where you say, okay, well, this doesn't fall in any of the emergency categories I have, but I don't know how much fuel I'm using. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to stay flying. And so the outcome of the flight is in doubt. And so they declared an emergency, Squawk 7700, and were able to make a safe precautionary landing, which is exactly the thing to do. So the takeaway for this one is, what is an emergency? It's when the outcome of the flight is in doubt. And if the outcome of the flight is in doubt, you should not hesitate to declare an emergency. What declaring an emergency gets you is it gets you priority assistance with ATC. It gets you easier access to resources you might need. It makes personnel on the ground aware that there might be something they need to deal with when you come into land at a particular airport. And if the outcome of the flight is in doubt, then it's an emergency, and it's good to kick some of those systems moving. Like I said, there's a couple of things we'll talk about with instrument failures later on. With a lot of these, we have been really focused on that, spending 90% of our time outside the airplane and 10% of our time on the instruments. So an instrument failure in these ones, you would be able to fly just using your references to the horizon just as well. So this is something that we will talk about more, because you should know how to recognize that the instruments are failing and what to do about it. But if you do encounter this sort of thing, use your attitude, use your horizon, and just fly the airplane just like normal. So the airplane will fly just fine without instruments. It doesn't necessarily need them. In fact, one of the training things that a lot of CFIs will do is they'll actually take a piece of paper and just cover up all of the instruments, because they don't want students who are focusing too much inside the plane. They want to force that focus to be outside. So if you're interested in that sort of approach to a lesson, let me know. I can point you towards a couple of resources on how that's usually done. Reading Bistro Matt's message here. Oh, interesting, Bistro Matt. Yeah, okay. So Bistro Matt's saying that he had that case happened with a fuel leak. So you had fuel in the cockpit, like it was coming into the cockpit of the plane. Um, and a Citabria, I think the one that had an issue here was also a Citabria. Um, uh, I actually love flying Citabrias, so don't get the wrong impression on them. But yeah, leading edge crack in a okay, leading edge crack on a standby tank. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, if you still knew how much fuel you had, then yeah, that's a great example, Bistro Matt, because I would apply that definition of like, is the outcome of the flight in doubt? And your PIC uh, may have said, I I am not concerned with the outcome of this flight. It just may be a problem of X, Y, and Z. I think as soon as I have fuel leaking, that starts to make me pretty nervous. But I guess it would depend a little bit on the specifics of how that aircraft is set up. Interesting. Good example, though. Yeah, and one of the other things that I'll mention on this while we're talking about declaring emergencies is there's sometimes a hesitancy to declare an emergency because like people don't want to deal with the paperwork or they don't want to deal with all those sorts of things. And for a lot of emergencies that are like you could call like maybe a precautionary emergency, I hesitate to use that because it's still an emergency from our definition. But where it's like, maybe I don't need to declare this, maybe I do. A lot of those things you never get any follow up questions about. It essentially gets you that priority resources, it gets you safely on the ground. And then if there's not much more interesting that happened, you just got on the ground safely and then the issue was fixed later. Um, a lot of those stories end with, and then I never heard from anyone about it again. So, um, something to keep in mind. All right, let's keep going. So, yeah, I'm curious, Bistromat, if the fuel in the cockpit. I still don't quite understand how that would work because like if you had fuel leaking into the cockpit, that seems. Oh, sure, because okay, I could see how that would come in. Got it. Okay, that was exactly what I was picturing as sort of like right below where that the fuel gauge is in the Citabria. Okay, so this guy in the back got sprayed on my son first. Great. Oh, that sounds like a real adventure. Well, I'm glad that you made it back okay. Um, okay. So then you just took the citation out, right? Afterwards? Easy. Wow, that's quite an experience. All right, I'm going to keep going through. We're going to talk about fire and failure today as kind of these two broad categories. There's a phrase that I heard recently that I really appreciated. I hadn't heard it put this way before, which is as pilots, there's a certain amount of known risk that we're taking on. And we do everything we can with our pre-flights and with our inspections and with our required documents and things like that to mitigate these risks. But just in the taking on the just in going out to fly, we're accepting a certain amount of risk. In the same way that when you go out driving on the highway, you're accepting a certain amount of risk just from that activity. So what we try to do with aviation is to make sure that those risks are really clear and understood so that we know how to mitigate them, but then also so we know how to respond to them if they become a problem. Um, an interesting analogy is if you haven't ever done, you may want to consider taking a high speed driving course. So something that like racetracks, for instance, will sometimes offer is like an emergency highway procedures course because most people have never done training on like how do you dodge a rolling tire when you're going 80 miles per hour on the highway. But they actually do have training for that, and you can go and practice. They set up cones in these lanes, and you learn how to change lanes at 80 miles per hour, and how much like how tight a space you can fit into. Um, and so that sort of like thinking about the risks and mitigating the risks, I think would be really good in driving as well. In aviation, it's like a key part of the training though. So this is a big part of what we do preparing to be a pilot. So anyway, so there's the three risks that we take on anytime we go flying: the risk of fire, failure, and collision. We've talked a lot about collision already. We talked about scanning for traffic while we're flying, also about things like checking for traffic at different points of the traffic pattern, or when we're taxiing around an airport, getting clearances so we're not like crossing a runway when someone's landing, all those sorts of things. Today we're going to talk more about fire and failure, the other two. And so Bistromet's example would be a good example of a failure. So some system of the plane malfunctioned in a way, and in that example where there's a failure of sort of the fuel system that then causes a leak, you're not going to find what to do in a POH with that. And so what we do instead is we talk about the systems of the aircraft, and so you can make an informed decision based on how the aircraft all works. And so that's where it's sort of like it would depend a little bit on the specifics of the plane and what the PIC was seeing and making that decision about how dangerous the situation was. There are a couple of ones that are situations that can emerge that, even if they're low risk of ever happening, knowing the standard procedure can make a big difference on the outcome of that particular problem. So those are the ones we're going to really talk more specifically about today, is situations where you may encounter a fire and what to do about it, and situations where you may encounter a failure and what to do about it. Again, these are all really unlikely, but part of being PIC, part of taking passengers up in an airplane, is having the training and knowing what to do in those scenarios. When you actually go work with a CFI and on your own training, they will on occasion give you failures. They'll just, especially later in your training, they'll kind of say, okay, you lost your engine, what are you going to do? And they're expecting you to have rehearsed the procedure enough, A, B, C, D, E, that you can just run through it, but also then make good decisions in kind of that heightened moment. One thing that I did when I was working on my commercial is I'm a big Apple nerd, and so I went through and I made a shortcut that actually I could run on my watch, and it would give me a randomly generated failure. And so, at least once a flight when I would go up and practice, I would go on my watch and hit, give me a random failure, and then whatever that emergency, then I would go and practice that procedure. And it was a way of sort of making sure I systematically checked that I knew all these procedures well, but also then to kind of make it a little bit more like catch you off guard. So we won't do that today. That stuff, you learn it now, talk about it here. You probably go in the real world and practice it a couple of times with your CFI. But then as you get further in your training, that's where it would be a little bit more, okay, so we're doing it cross country and you lost oil pressure. What's going to happen? What are you going to do? All right, so let's talk about fires then. 3 types of fires we're going to talk about: engine fire, electrical fire, and wingtip fire. And for engine fire, there's really 2 different scenarios of engine fire that we think of. One is in the air, and the other is during start on the ground. So let's start with the in the air. This is where we talk about the emergency descent maneuver. I put this in the same format as a maneuver like the ground reference maneuvers or our steep turns or those sorts of maneuvers. And I think it's fair to think of it that way. Usually if you're doing this maneuver, it's in the context of simulated engine fire. So you could do this emergency descent if you had another reason you needed to lose altitude really quickly. But it's actually meant more in this case about, well, let's pull this open. I'm sorry. What I want to do actually is go POH side by side with lesson plan. So I'm going to pull up from the POH and we're going to go through and talk about specifically what the Cessna 172 SP POH says to do about each of these. And the reason I want to emphasize that is when you're starting training in a new plane, you want to make sure you understand these procedures through thoroughly. Not just what the specific procedures are and memorize the things you need to memorize, but also how it relates to the system, like how the fuel system works in the plane that would make the procedure operate that way. So we'll look in here. So we have engine failures, forced landings. We're going to jump down to fires. We'll talk a little bit more about these engine failures, and of course, forced landings was the lesson yesterday. So we're going to 3-7. Okay, great. So let's talk about, we might as well start with during start on the ground, which is if you, for instance, you turn the ignition over to start, and then you see flames coming out of the cowling for whatever reason. The basic goal, if you have an engine fire on the ground during start, is you want to get the engine to actually start so you can suck the flames back into the engine. So the best case scenario is the engine actually begins running. So that would be like if the engine starts, leave the power on for a few minutes and then shut it down. But you really want to start by continuing to crank. So you turn the airplane on, it starts to spin, there's flames coming out, and you want to keep the engine, the ignition switch on start to continue spinning the engine. Again, trying to suck those flames in. If the engine fails to start, then it's throttle full open, mixture idle cutoff, cranking continues, so you're continuing to hold the starter on start. You want to turn the fuel shutoff valve off, auxiliary fuel pump off, use the fire extinguisher if you want, or if it makes sense. Otherwise, master off, ignition off, and get out of the airplane. And then if you have that fire extinguisher, which hopefully your aircraft has one in there, you take that and you can spray the engine from when you're outside of the aircraft. And then they have this inspect phase, which if you have a fire in your engine, you should have a mechanic look at it, but that's sort of what it finishes with. Two things to point out about these, and we'll see these in all of them. The bold section here is what Cessna calls the memorization items or memory items. And so anything that you see in bold is what they expect for you to have memorized from this procedure. It's also what your CFI will expect you to have memorized from that procedure. And so everything not in bold, they consider something you could pull the checklist out and try and go from there. Or if it was forgotten, it wouldn't be like mission critical necessarily. But anything you see in bold, when we talk about memorizing the procedures, that's like the really important focus areas. I really like that Cessna does that. A lot of POHs don't have that sort of bolding, but it gives a really good sense of what the critical steps are in each of these. Okay, so to bring this engine fire during start to a little bit more conceptual level, we have the basic goal is to continue cranking to suck the flames into the engine. If it starts, then you can let it run, shut it down. If it doesn't start, then you're essentially removing fuel from the system. So your throttle's full open, so you're actually putting the throttle all the way in, but then you're pulling the mixture all the way out. So open the throttle to get the fuel pulled into the engine really quick while you pull the mixture back. Pulling the mixture back cuts off all the fuel. You're going to continue cranking through that whole thing so the engine's always spinning, always pulling more fuel. And then you're taking the fuel shutoff valve out and the auxiliary fuel pump off. Let's go and look in the plane real quick at what that looks like. So we have this aircraft. Everything's off. So if we had a engine fire, and by the way, this is how whenever I go to a new airplane to practice the emergency procedures at first, I rent the aircraft and I just sit in the pilot seat and do them through. First, just slowly identifying each of the things I'm going to do, thinking about the conceptual, why am I doing this for this particular kind of failure, but then really practicing it until I have that proficiency, and then practicing it in flight, of course. So they say we want to keep our ignition switch cranking. So this is our ignition switch. So during this, we would have this over on start and just holding it there. They say we want the throttle. If the engine fails to start, it's throttle full open. So that's this switch here. And that's going to give maximum RPM for the engine to pull the fuel through. Mixture to idle cutoff, so that's all the way back. Fuel shutoff valve, so this is going to stop fuel from flowing from the tanks. So that, oops, it's already out. So that sort of makes sense. We pull that all the way out. One quick note, the fuel shutoff valve actually usually comes out to like here in a real airplane, in a real Cessna 172. So the fact that you can barely see it's off isn't quite right. It actually comes out to like here. But anyway, we pull that all the way out. Again, cutting off fuel flow to the engine. So we've removed it at the mixture. We've removed it here. And then we want to turn the auxiliary fuel pump off. We probably would have that off anyway, unless we were doing some weird start procedure. But they want to make sure it's off so that you're not just shooting more fuel into that fire. At that point, then we've now turned all of these. Okay, so we would be continuing to crank through that entire thing. Eventually, we're going to have no fuel in the system. There's usually a fire extinguisher right here, so we could grab that, Could spray on the inside. It may make more sense to just get out of the plane. So turning our master off, that switch, ignition switch off, so that's where we would stop cranking, and then exit the aircraft. And we want to get away from the fire, but also then if we can put it out, that's great. Okay, so to summarize, continue cranking, try and suck the engine flames in, and then if the engine does not start, then you want to remove fuel from the system, and follow the memory items here. So memorize what that flow is. All right, let's go to the next one. So this is a engine fire in air. And so essentially what you're doing in this case is the same basic idea of removing fuel from the system. So it's that mixture idle cutoff, fuel shutoff valve pulled out, auxiliary fuel pump off. And so when I do that as a flow. So I actually start here to here, and then back to here. And the reason I do that in the plane is if you look, remember we talked about flows before. I'll tell you what, I'm gonna do this instead actually. I think this will work okay. So you can see just right next door. So engine fire in flight, fuel shutoff valve off, mixture idle cutoff, fuel pump off. Usually you aren't flying with the fuel pump on anyway, so but it's good to have that part of your flow. So again, this sort of L shape, and I'm using the items I see on the dash to remind myself of each of the things that I'm doing. That's the flow. And then master switch off. So master switch off removes any electricity that's flowing through the system if the cause of the fire is some sort of electrical short or some other problem like that. Taking the master switch out of the system may then stop whatever's sparking it. If it caught on fire because of something else, then basically you're just removing that as a variable. You want cabin heat and air off if the fire is going on in the I am totally blanking. Under the cowling, if the fire is going on in the engine, it may be pouring into the aircraft. Let's actually look briefly at why that is. I forgot this doesn't have it. So one thing, and we had this for a previous homework assignment, but there's this diagram of how the airflow works for the aircraft. Part of the reason we study this is, one, we want to make sure we know how the air all flows in and how the system works in a typical operation, but also a case like this where you say, okay, well, the reason I want to turn the air off is that all of our air flows through this, through the engine compartment. So if there's smoke in the engine compartment, that's all just pouring into the aircraft. And so we want to shut that all off. But we can open these vents because these vents don't come through at all. And so we would, I can't turn that off, but this is the hot air entry. So we would turn that. That's all the way on, that's all the way off. So we'd push that all the way in. And then we would open these ones, which actually open directly to the outdoors. And so now we have cut off smoke that's flowing in through here, and we've started airflow into the cabin. Maybe open up this window too to get the air flowing back out, but you want to just clear the smoke. Okay, go back to section 3 here. Okay, so all of those things, I know as we're talking about them, we've been doing it in slow motion, but all of those things should take no time at all. So it's fuel shutoff valve on, mixture idle cutoff, fuel pump off, master off, and then close your fuel pumps or your vents and open the air here. This would be very obvious if you have fuel or smoke pouring in. Almost at the same time you're doing that, you're entering this emergency descent. And the POH for Cessna says to enter an airspeed of 100 knots. And if the fire is not extinguished, increase the glide speed to find an airspeed within airspeed limitations, which will provide an incombustible mixture. So essentially, you're trying to get so much airflow through under the cowling through the engine that the fire can't burn anymore. So you're trying to extinguish it by just having so much airflow that it blows it out, essentially. So 100 knots is what they recommend. This is a good one maybe to actually demonstrate sort of what it looks like. But that's essentially what we're doing is we're cutting off fuel to the system, turning off our electrical system, clearing out the cabin from air, and then almost simultaneously rolling into a 30 to 45 degree bank and letting our nose drop to get to 100 knots airspeed. This is one of the maneuvers you're required to demonstrate on the check ride. So you'll want to practice with your CFI. let me... Why don't I quickly show what that looks like, just so you get a sense. I won't flip into VR because we'll do this pretty fast and we won't do... yeah, we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but let me get this all going. See if I can just do a quick start here. Oops, forgot the brakes. Don't forget the brakes. Okay. All right, so I'm gonna just pop up here. So same as the setup for our other procedures, we want to do clearing turns. So 2 clearing turns, 90 degrees each. Emergency field ID'd, mixture rich. We want to be at an altitude for this one above 3,000 feet AGL. So we go 3,500 is okay. And then we're going to simulate the engine fire flow. So we're going to touch each control. Of course, in the actual aircraft, we don't, when we're simulating the emergency, we don't actually pull those things out. We don't want to actually cut the engine off from power. But we do simulate it, and we will pull the throttle back to simulate the engine dying. And then we'll start the bank. We'll bank to 30 or 45. And we want to experience positive load factor while we're doing that. So we 30 to 45 degree bank, airspeed of 100 knots, and we should have some amount of back pressure. We should feel like we're being pushed into the seat. Once we've extinguished the fire, then we execute a forced landing. So typically how that would work is your instructor would say something like, okay, the fire is extinguished now. They'll say something like the fire is extinguished, and the implication is you no longer have an engine, so you need to now make an emergency landing. Part of the reason we talked about emergency landings yesterday is that this, depending on the issue, something like a fire in flight, then you would need to execute that emergency landing. So, okay, so let's do that. So I'm gonna hop back in here. Let's see if I can get this aircraft stabilized quickly enough. So we can use, going a little fast. I don't really want to I want to go VA if I can. Of course, in a real fire, then your priority is to get to 100 knots anyway. So that's okay, but we'll go a little slower so we can show that entry. Okay, so we'll say that we've done our clearing turns, we've ID'd our emergency field, which actually we are just over from Palo Alto right there, so don't forget about the airport behind you if you're near an airport. Make sure we're stabilized, which I'm not quite. Go. Forgot the reason that I have been flying in VR lately. Okay, so then we would say engines pouring out, or fires pouring out of the cowling. What are we going to do? Okay, so we do our flow, fuel shut off, mixture off, fuel pump off, and then our master off. And now we're rolling into a 30 degree bank, 30 to 45 degree bank, letting the nose drop and trying to get to 100 knots airspeed. So there is our 100 knots. We're at about a 40 degree bank, which is just fine. And then we would hold this at 100 knots until the examiner or the CFI says, okay, the fire's been extinguished. In the real world, if the fire hasn't extinguished yet, let the nose drop further and accelerate more. You don't want to get to the yellow caution area there, but a little bit more airspeed may be what you need to recover. After that, then we would switch over to our standard emergency procedure, ABCDE, so airspeed, best landing field. So now I'm getting to 68, our best glide, and our emergency field. We'll use Palo Alto. Stay coordinated here. Checklist, so then we would do, in this case, we aren't going to try and restart because we know the engine's already lost. And so instead we go right to declare, and we say, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Oh, we don't have any electrical. You may want to turn your battery on to get back to the radio. Depending on what the source of the fire was, that could then re-cause the problem to start. If it's fire pouring out of the cowling, out of the engine, the electrical system's a different system. It shouldn't aggravate the problem, but something to be aware of. The best glide's not great here. But at any rate, so Mayday, 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 Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, 1,300, engine fire, emergency landing, Palo Alto, and then Squawk 7700. Keeping that field in sight. I want to get to my key position 1,000 feet above, so we're looking pretty good here. I don't think I have my altimeter set correctly. Yeah. Well, that's why you set your altimeter before you go out flying. But then we do the rest of these. Remember, the Cessna has electrical flaps, so we've now removed the electrical system from our, we've turned the master off, and so we don't have that option. Again, this is where judgment call, and if you want to turn your master back on to get those flaps. Otherwise, you can execute a no flap landing, which we're going to talk about in about 2 seconds. So, okay. So there's the emergency descent and sort of what the actual flight down looks like. I'm going to flip back to this, and then I'm going to restart so we're back on the ground. Oops. Okay. I did something in the chat. Shoot. So no, the check ride does not include a full in-air engine restart. It does not. The expectation is that for any maneuver that would include or imply a loss of engine, that you're pulling the throttle back to idle, and then you're touching the different control surfaces that you would use to recover from that, but you're not actually pulling the mixture or anything like that. It used to be, I don't know how long ago, but it used to be in training that instructors actually would pull the mixture out and kill the engine. The reasoning being that to bring the engine back to life, as long as the propeller is spinning, the magnetos are firing, and so to get the engine back going again, you just bring in mixture and the engine will kick back up. But they were finding that too often resulted in actual emergencies, and so they said just bring the engine, the throttle to idle, and that's good enough to simulate loss of power. It removes almost all the thrust you have, and so it's pretty much the same thing. Shoots. I don't know if that's what you meant by doesn't include a full in-air engine restart. Yeah. Okay. So it's not. They wouldn't actually kill the engine. Like they wouldn't kill the engine. They would definitely simulate it, and they would expect you to know how to do that whole recovery flow. In the flight, they probably wouldn't ask you many more details, or if they did, you can always say, "We'll talk about that when we're on the ground after the emergency." Would be a very reasonable response. But yeah, what they might ask you either before or if they try to ask you during an emergency, I would say, I'll tell you later. Basically, like you want them to shut up because they're going to try and probably distract you because they want to see how you're going to handle it. And so saying like, we'll talk about it when we get on the ground would be very reasonable. But they may ask you why you do certain things in that emergency flow. So they might say, okay, you're removing the mixture, you're turning off the electrical. What are you thinking about? And one is, well, I'm doing the flow to restart, but also I'm thinking about, securing fuel, securing electrical systems before we land. Yeah, good question. Okay, so that's our in-air engine fire and our emergency descent maneuver. So again, the success here is that you've banked in at 30 to 40 degrees with a positive load factor. You're looking for about 100 knots. 100 knots or more would be a good way to think about it. But below the speed that the aircraft is going to have any structural damage. And then it's the flow that we use to extinguish the fire. So remove fuel from the system, turn off the master, and then get to an airspeed to extinguish the fire. Okay, so we talked about during start on the ground. We talked about in air. Another type of fire that you may potentially encounter is an electrical fire. So let's look at what the POH has to say about that. Please, as I go. All right. So electrical fire, again, they have that same sort of bolded. You want to know the first couple of them down pat. Shoots is asking if after the procedure you'd ask, is the fire out, and adding power to the engine. Yes, that's a great way to do it. Most of the examiners would tell you when the fire's out, but if you've held that for a little bit, you get to 100 knots, and you hold it for honestly even just a couple of seconds and say, is the fire extinguished? They're probably going to say yeah, because they've seen that you've done the procedure. They see and you understand the goal is to extinguish the fire, and so they probably tell you to continue. Probably they wouldn't want you to add power, though. They'd probably want you to then continue into a emergency landing procedure. So that's that ABCDE stuff. And then once you get through that, more than likely what they're going to do is they're going to have you go all the way through getting to the key point of the landing. And if you can get to the key point successfully and everything's well, and you've chosen a field that aligns, is landing into the wind, so you've chosen a good field, that would probably be where they'd say, okay, you can go around now. If you remember, our minimum altitude that we can fly at is 1,000 feet above in congested areas. For some reason, I feel like it's a different word, but essentially where there's a lot of people, we can only fly 1,000 feet AGL. And so your key point is 1,000 feet AGL. And so from the examiner's perspective, they don't want to be giving you instructions that would take you below the FAR allowed minimum altitudes. So that's usually why they recover at the key point. Just sort of like a practical side of things. I actually, on my private pilot check ride, one of the things that the examiner sort of tested me with, at least I think, it's sort of hard to know what their reasoning is sometimes, but they asked me to descend lower than I would feel comfortable for an emergency maneuver. It was an uncongested area, so we could have gone down to like 500 feet and still been okay. But they had asked me to continue descending through this beyond the key point and starting to do the recovery. And I said, I can't remember exactly what I said, but something like, for a non-emergency practice, I'd like to recover at 1,000, or I'm going to recover at 1,000, so we have enough altitude for if we lose an engine or something like that. And the rationale is I'm PIC for your check ride, you're the PIC, and you need to be demonstrating good reasoning as a PIC. And I didn't feel comfortable descending down to that altitude. I didn't know the area super well where I was for my check ride. I had an emergency field in mind I could have used, but if we really had an emergency, I don't want to be at 500 feet figuring it out. And so essentially saying, I'm not going to, basically telling the examiner, I'm not going to do that because as PIC operating or, exercising my authority as PIC, I don't feel comfortable with this. And it's not, and I also, you don't have to do it for the ACS. So you can say like, basically no. Some examiners actually do test you on that. They will ask you to do something that is against the FARs and make sure you don't do it. So I don't know if that's actually what they were doing or not, but that didn't really matter because I didn't feel like it was a safe thing to do, and so I declined. Right. Yep. They're not going to They're not going to purposely put you in an unsafe or illegal scenario, right? Because they would never want that on them. They may ask you to do something like that, and if you seem like you're going to do it, then they would interrupt you and say, "Okay, that's a failure because you did an illegal thing." Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. The one that always boggles my mind, but I've heard of folks doing this, is they go for a private pilot check ride. For the private pilot, we've already talked about the weather minimums, right? You need to be a certain distance from clouds, depending on what airspace you're in. And students will go and they'll go out for a check ride and then they'll fly too close to a cloud. And the examiner is sort of like, because as soon as you break an FAR, that's an immediate check ride bust. Sometimes distances are hard to judge. If it was like, you're 1,800 feet from that cloud horizontally, not 2,000, maybe there's some wiggle room there. But like if you're flying directly below a cloud, and you know that you need to have 500 feet below the cloud, like you can't do that. You can't be like buzzing the bottom of a cloud. Yeah, it's sort of interesting, right? Again, different examiners have different processes that they use and things that they care about. So there's some wisdom to trying to learn more about your examiner before you go, but it's not unheard of to have them do essentially to like test your knowledge in real time during that flight. So but anyway, probably the best tip that I would give in general for taking check rides though is, especially in high stress situations, emergency procedures, coming in, takeoff, landing, they're probably going to try and distract you. And as PIC, it is very, very reasonable for you to say, we'll talk about this later, or, just politely say like, I'd love to answer your question when we're on the ground. Because you don't need the extra distraction. They want to know that you're prioritizing flying over chit chat. So they're going to like it anyway. And also you don't want to be dealing with it. You don't want that distraction. It's just not good practice. So anyway, okay, that was a little bit more on check rides than I expected, but hopefully that's sort of interesting. And the emergency procedures, like I said, we simulate them, but we don't cause emergencies. So we'll still have engine power. We just want to touch all the controls we would touch and announce them as we do them. All right, so electrical fire in flight. So as you can imagine, for electrical fire, we want to remove the electrical, we want to disconnect the electrical system, so master switch is off. I will go back to the airplane so we can look at this together. So in this case, it would be, we're flying around, we have the electrical system on. First thing we're doing is master switch off, remove the electrical system from there. We want to close the vents, cabin air heat. That's these ones again. The most likely place that you're going to have some sort of electrical fire would be in something of the electronics going on in the front area here. And so you might have then smoke coming through, especially if it's burning insulation. It can be really dark and kind of hard to see. And so you want to close off any airflow that would be bringing additional smoke into the area. And then you want to activate the fire extinguisher, especially if there's like flames coming out down here, maybe down where your feet are. A couple other things then they'll say is essentially avionics master off, all other switches except the ignition switch. So removing all the other electrical elements. And then after you've exhausted everything in the cabin, opening up the vents to clear out the cabin of whatever smoke might be in there. Having spoken with folks who have had this sort of emergency before, some of the things that they weren't anticipating was how dark the smoke can be and how quickly it can fill up the cabin. And so it'll be pretty obvious at the time that you need to clear that smoke. But you just want to make sure you've closed off these vents so you're not pulling more in by accident. Another thing is you want to know what kind of fire extinguisher you have in your aircraft, because different fire extinguishers work differently. So we don't need to go into it a ton more now, but it's worth looking up, especially whatever aircraft you're in. You want to look at what the label says it is. The classic kind of TV fire extinguisher, it shoots out that kind of white chemical foam thing that puts out the fire. Well, the problem with the white chemical foam is if you're shooting that all over your flight deck, all of a sudden you can't see any of your instruments and you might not be able to see out your window. So actually a lot of aircraft use instead a halogen fire extinguisher. And so that shoots out a halogen gas, which will also extinguish the fire, but it's clear. And so it puts the fire out, but it doesn't make sure it wouldn't make it so you can't see any of your instruments anymore. I really appreciate when I fly in a plane that has a halogen fire extinguisher. If I notice it's not a halogen fire extinguisher, that is something I put in the back of my mind in case I need to use it in an emergency is, if I just go wildly spraying this around the flight deck, which isn't probably a good idea anyway, but if you were to do that and it comes out foamy white, now you have a different sort of problem to deal with. Better to get the fire extinguished, obviously, but still good to be aware of. If you do need your electrical power, right, so we've now gone through, we turned the master switch off, we've cut off the flow of the smoke, and we've used the fire extinguisher. Those are our memory items. Then we go through these other things, which is essentially removing other electrical items from the system, clearing the smoke out of the cabin. If the fire is extinguished and you need electrical power in order to make it to the airport, so if you don't need electrical power, leave it all out of your system. The aircraft's engine, if you remember, we talked about magnetos. The magnetos work when the engine propeller is spinning. And so the propeller system and the engine and the electrical system are totally different systems. So if you turn the master off, if you removed every single electrical element from the plane, the engine would still operate just fine because the magnetos that generate the spark generate a spark as a contained unit. So as long as the propeller is spinning, that motion is used by the magnetos to create that spark every time it turns. One thing CFIs will do with private pilots going out flying and say something like, because at that point they should know these systems, and so they'd say, okay, if I turn the master battery off, what's going to happen? And it's not unheard of for a new pilot to say, oh, you're going to lose your engine. And it's like, okay, well, let's do it. And then they turn the master off, and sure enough, the engine keeps firing just fine because it's designed to be this whole other self-contained system. The reason I mention that is that if you're near enough to an airport that you don't need to add your electrical system back in, you have reason to believe that something in the electrical system caused the fire. You don't really want to reignite that fire by accident, so just leave it out. Fly back with no electrical. And that's where we come to like using the light guns at the airport. Like if you arrive at an airport, there's no way to communicate, and you're circling above the airport, like maybe 500 feet above traffic pattern altitude, the tower's going to see you. They're going to realize that you don't have a radio, you've lost your electrical. They're going to start using the light guns to bring you in because they don't want you just flying around their airspace. One other thing to mention, declaring an emergency is something you do. How do I say this best? We've talked about squawking 7700 to declare an emergency. We've talked about on the radio, Mayday, 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 all of those things. If you've lost your electrical system, there's no way to declare those things. But the criteria for declaring an emergency is that you've declared it. So if you are on, like, in the flight deck and no one else can hear you and say, I'm declaring an emergency, that's sufficient. So at that point, you're allowed to deviate from the FARs to meet that emergency. And so flying into the Delta airspace and circling would be a reasonable deviation to get the airplane on the ground. And then circling above the airport, they'll eventually see you, light gun you in, and then you land. Maybe you'll get some paperwork, maybe you won't, but it's pretty reasonable to explain if you say, well, I had an electrical fire, I was at the airport, I didn't want to turn everything back on, reignite the fire, so I came in to land. Okay, but if you did need to turn on your electrical for whatever reason, you've now removed all of the circuits that you can, so you're not sure which one caused the fire, but you've removed everything. You turn the master on, and you check your circuit breakers, these things, to see if any of them have come up or if they're faulty. And if they have popped out, you don't want to reset it because that's an indication that that might be your problem. Everything else should be off. You turn your avionics master on, and then you're going to turn each item on one at a time. So let me show you what this looks like actually in the plane. So I've turned my master on here. I have power is now flowing through the system, but I have all of my lights off. So if I left the plane and looked on the side, I don't have any like rotating beacon or any of my side lights. So there's no current flowing through those systems. The other thing that I want to do is turn the avionics off, because as soon as I hit this avionics master switch, that's going to send power to each of these. And I don't know which one of these is causing me problems. This is where you should study if you haven't yet, but this is where knowing how the electrical system of your plane works is really important. Again, something we'll cover in more detail a little later on, but there's diagrams that tell you how power flows through the system, and so you know when you remove things or add things, kind of what you're doing. But the short version, at least for the case of the emergency, is you want to turn off everything if you're going to start adding things, because you don't know what it was that caused the electrical fire, and you don't want to accidentally reignite it. So we'd go in here and we'd actually go to on the Garmin 350, the power is on the volume, and so we turn this power all the way to off. We go to the next one, do the same thing, turn it all the way to off. Autopilot, there's no way to turn off on here. Transponder is already off, but we turn that off. And then we'd also turn off the ADF, which is this one. Okay, so now when we turn on the master, we've removed as much of the electrical as we can, so we hopefully won't just reignite it. We turn this on. Okay, great. So classic Microsoft Flight Sim, that didn't actually matter if I turned the power off or not, but it wouldn't have come on. At least the ADF didn't. And then we'd slowly add on just the electronics that we need to make it back safely. So probably I would turn on one of my comm devices. That would give me my radio. Maybe my transponder, but honestly, if you have a radio that's good enough for communication, you can declare your emergency, you can communicate with the tower, and that's probably all you really need. Every piece of electrical that you add is a risk that you may be accidentally reigniting the fire, so you don't really want to. That's so funny, I can't believe it doesn't turn off. Well, anyway, but like this, the ADF we turned off the same way, you just dial the power back. So, okay. Anything else on here? Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. So again, electrical fire in flight, the biggest thing is you want to turn the master off, remove all the electricity from the system. And then you're clearing out the cabin, so stop any air flowing through by turning off the airflow here, and then use your fire extinguisher to put it out. Let's talk about cabin fire. So electrical fire would be like, usually this would be described as you have flames coming out from underneath here where your feet are. Cabin fire would be like a fire down here. So Bistro Matt's example of, you have fuel that's squirting out from up here into the cabin. That would be my biggest concern, would be, okay, well, we may have a fire in the cabin. And so it's the same sort of procedure. You're essentially going to remove the electrical because it may be something about the wiring that goes like out to the plane or something like that. Again, close your air vents, stop the smoke from coming in, and then fire extinguisher activate. The other thing then is just to land the plane as soon as possible, inspect for damage. So. The last one we'll talk about is a wingtip fire, which sort of falls under an electrical fire, but a slightly different procedure. So a wingtip fire would be, for instance, the wiring that takes power out to uh, the lights on the end of the wing is in the same rough part of the body as of the wings as the fuel tank. So obviously they're designed to be separate. They're designed to not have any problems. But if you encountered a fire that was out at the wingtip here, your biggest concern is getting that fire away from the fuel tank, because that's obviously a potentially really bad scenario. So what you're thinking about is, okay, I want to remove the spark, so I want to cut off power to that, and then I also want to make sure the flame stays away from the fuel tank. So the things you do then is you have your landing and taxi lights both come off, because the landing light is right here. So there's some amount of wires that go that way. And then your navigation lights are the ones that are on the end, as well as your strobe light is out here too. Pitot heat would go to here. So that's an electrical system that goes out to the pitot tube here. And so we're turning off all of those because all of those things are potential causes of the wing fire. So we flip all of those off down our panel here. And then they say to perform a side slip to keep the flames away from the fuel tank and the cabin. You want to land as soon as possible and only use your flaps that are required for final approach and touchdown. So again, the flaps are electrical, so you want to avoid any electrical current going there if you can, so you don't need to use your flaps, at least until you're coming in. We've already talked about side slips and forward slips, so we know that that is when the aircraft is being positioned so that the fuselage is being put into the airstream. In this application, if you imagine we're coming in and we're flying, so let's say that the right wing tip has a fire going on, we want to side slip so that our airstream is going this way. So we're less efficient, we're more draggy because we have our fuselage into the air, but we're keeping the fire then way away. So all the airflow is going this way, the fire is going to be getting blown that way. Okay, so that's a lot about fire. Let's keep going on to failure things, which is we'll just keep going. Any questions on fire, definitely feel free to shoot them in the chat and we can talk about them a bit more. A couple failures to be aware of. Engine failure during flight. We already talked about this. This is that emergency landing. If you have an engine failure during the takeoff roll, we can look at the POH guide for that, but the short version is that you want to bring the power to idle and get on the brakes. So, and here's where they mention that bold-faced are immediate action items. So if you have an engine failure during takeoff roll, your throttle idle, apply the brakes. You can retract the wing flaps if you have them down. That will then decrease the amount of lift the wings are creating, and so that will keep you on the ground better, allow you to brake more strongly. Mixture idle cutoff, ignition switch off, master switch off. So in that case, you're essentially preventing whatever might be going on with the engine. You want to make sure that that doesn't become a fire or something like that. But the biggest thing is you want to cancel your takeoff roll and then get off the runway. For engine failure immediately after takeoff, the biggest thing, aviate, navigate, communicate. If you have an engine failure at a low altitude, your main priority is to aviate. And so the only memory item they have here is the airspeed to use. 70 knots for flaps up, 65 for flaps down. You'll notice that best glide is actually 68 and they say 70 here. My understanding is that's because at this point, if you're having an engine failure at 200 feet, you just want to get as close to the ballpark as you can, but really you're focused on just fly the plane through the landing, and then everything else you can figure out later. If you do have time, you can do mixture idle cutoff, fuel shutoff valve off. It's the same securing flow that we do for once we've determined the engine isn't going to come back to life. So we're removing fuel, we're securing the fuel system, securing the electrical system. Again, unlatch the cabin door and land straight ahead. When we go out to fly, there's this pre-takeoff brief that we do, and we've done it a couple of times on this flight, but also something we do in the real world, which is thinking through what are we going to do in a bunch of different scenarios in case something happens while we're taking off. Again, it's super unlikely, but you want to be ready for it in case you need to do it. So one of them we talked about is how far along the runway am I going to go before I decide that I don't have the power I need? So we say if you haven't developed 75% of the power or 75% of your airspeed by the time you're at 50%, 50% of the runway, then you should abort the takeoff. So if you haven't developed 70% of your power, that means something's probably wrong, and that gives you enough time to stop and taxi off the end of the runway. So that's the first part of our safety brief, is if I haven't developed 70% of my rotation speed by the time I'm at 50% of the runway, then I will bring power to idle and full brakes and taxi off the runway. 70% for us, our rotation speed is 55, so 70 is about 40. And at Palo Alto, there's actually this kind of Barber pole that we use as our 50% point. We've been doing a lot of using Bravo or Charlie if we're landing or taking off that way or this way, which is okay. It's a little short of 50%, but we don't really need that much runway anyway, so it hasn't been a problem. Yeah, we usually use the Barber pole in the real Palo Alto. So, okay. The other one, engine failure immediately after takeoff, is also part of our pre-takeoff brief. So we talk about if we have a failure below traffic pattern altitude, we'll plan to land straight ahead. One of the temptations, if you haven't thought through the math on it, is to try and turn back to the runway at pretty much whatever altitude. And the problem with trying to turn back to the runway when you're at a low altitude is, remember that to turn, you have to divert some of your lift vector into the horizontal plane, which means you have less lift in the vertical plane, which means that you're sinking more quickly. So you're already at a low altitude. In turning, now you're making yourself sink faster. You have to turn aggressively enough that you're getting back to the runway and actually pointed at it, which again means you're descending even faster. And not only that, but you actually have to turn, right? So if you had a failure at low altitude at Palo Alto, you're taking off here, you have to turn not just 180 degrees, but 215 to come back to the runway, and then another 15 to get to here. And so to have the altitude to do that full maneuver without losing control of the aircraft is really tricky until you get to about traffic pattern altitude, which is why we say, especially for new pilots, traffic pattern altitude or lower. If you're below traffic pattern altitude, plan to land straight ahead. It's, again, much safer to fly the airplane through the landing than to try and turn back and potentially end up in a state, if you misjudge this and your wings are 30 degrees bank and you're really low altitude, you could end up having a landing over here where we have power lines. Or you might have a situation where you're just landing in a point that you're not expecting because you lose so much more lift than you might expect. So again, that's why we say you want to do traffic pattern altitude or traffic pattern altitude at a minimum for turning back to the runway. I will tell a quick story since it's relevant to that, which is my flying club. One of the things that they used to allow, and they no longer allow, is that CFIs were allowed to go out with students and let them, in a safe, controlled way, try that 180 degree turnaround. It's really more than 180 degrees, but like basically trying to turn back to the runway. And so they would do this as a way to demonstrate to them how hard it is to do it in any kind of meaningful way and why you want to use traffic pattern altitude as a minimum. By the way, if you do want to try this, a great way to do it is go to 3,500 feet, normal maneuvering, sort of minimums, and try doing it. Try pulling out your engine and see how long it takes you to turn back all the way to landing on the runway. But what they were doing was they would do it, at 600 or 800 feet and then turn back to the runway, and then they would do a go around as it became obvious that this is super hard to do. And of course, no one in the traffic pattern and other safety precautions. But the reality was, because you're in this situation where you're at low airspeeds, low altitude, you're trying to maneuver, so you're turning and dealing with a bunch of other variables, and there's a lot going on. The club had issues with planes getting damaged from CFIs trying to demonstrate this and then getting it wrong. And so they just made a blanket rule of like, no more demonstrating how hard this is. Just explain that it's really hard, and you can do it at altitude if you want to show what that looks like. The PHAC actually has another good image of this, which I probably should grab actually, but it shows sort of like, here's how much altitude it takes. And it's like, if you had an engine loss at 400 feet and you try to turn back, you're going to be, by the time you get to the runway, you're like negative 300 feet AGL. So, okay. Belabored that point, maybe too much, but that's the reason that we land straight ahead is because trying to turn back below that traffic pattern altitude is a very hard maneuver to pull off. And it's much better to land controlled landing, fly the plane through. Okay, so there's our failure of the engine. Of course, we talked about during flight yesterday, so that's a whole other thing. If you have a failure of the electrical system, there's a couple of different ways that this can fail, and it's worth reading through after the stream the different types of failures. But essentially, you have like an excess charge from the ammeter, a low voltage indicator if, for instance, the ammeter is discharging, and then what you do with those different things. So the short version is that if you have an electrical problem, you want to remove the alternator from the system. Well, let's just start at the beginning one here. So let's go in here and look at the plane. And this is actually an interesting one in the flight sim. So I went out flying actually yesterday, and not a 172 SP, but a pretty similar aircraft. And I've mentioned in the past when the aircraft starts up, the ammeter is at like 30 or something like that. And I said that it's usually like just above 0. So I thought that was kind of weird. But okay, so let's start with low voltage annunciator. So we don't have the engine running, so there's no power being generated by the alternator, which means that we have this low voltage annunciator come on. That's what we expect during startup because we don't have the engine spinning. But if we saw this in flight and the propeller was spinning, that indicates to us that the alternator isn't charging the battery. And so what we can do with that, so I'm looking at this lower section. Illumination of volts on the annunciator panel may occur during low RPM settings of electrical load. So if you're taxiing around, you get low RPM, or you have low RPMs, it may not be generating enough. So you can get some false positives on the ground. But in the flight, it can be a real problem. And the first thing you want to do is essentially cycle the master switch. So this first step here says all of these are essentially saying the alternator may have had a temporary influx where it created more energy for a moment than it normally does that tripped a relay that caused it to be removed from the electrical system. And so that transient something just odd happened wouldn't happen again if it was reconnected, but just some fluke of the electrical system. And that's not a concern in and of itself. And so what they say to do is you want to remove the avionics master switch and then check that the alternator field circuit, that's this one right here, is in so that the circuit didn't pop out. You're turning the master switch off, and you're turning the master switch back on. And in turning the master switch off and on, and so we remove the avionics so that we don't send a jolt through the avionics system. We always want to have the avionics off before we turn the master off. Otherwise, you can get like a jolt of electricity that can fry your avionics. So anyway, we turn the master off and master back on. In turning it off and on, that will reset that relay and it may reconnect the alternator and solve your problem basically. So that's the first thing that we try is we turn the master switch on, then we check the low volt sign, and if it's off, then we can turn the avionics master on, let the system kind of come back, and that may just solve the problem. So alternator got disconnected for some reason of some transient electrical thing, not a big deal. Avionics off, master off, and then master on. When the master's on, resets the relay, avionics on, and everything looks good, then good to go. Notice that none of these are memory items. There's no black bold text here. And so if this happened to you in the real aircraft, this is a very reasonable one to grab your checklist, follow it through, and see what you're going to do. Okay, let's talk about the situation where the low volts illuminates again. So in this case, now we think that there's a problem that isn't fixed by just resetting the relay. So something's wrong with the alternator. And so we're going to turn off the alternator, just the alternator half of the master. So you saw in the bottom left here, just the alternator side. And then I'm going to shed non-essential electrical equipment. So if I had all my lights on, maybe I had my pitot heat on. Well, we'll say we had all our lights on. If you have your pitot heat on and it's icing, we'll talk about in 2 seconds, then you probably want to leave that on. Pitot heat draws a lot of power. So actually, if you watch the ammeter, I'll turn the pitot heat on here. See how much it dropped? Oh, you can't see it. Sorry. So if I turn the pitot heat off here, you can see, watch how much it drops when I turn that pitot heat on. Okay, so but as we shed more and more of this electrical, so I'll start turning lights off, watch the amp meter goes up, right? And so for each of these that I can shed, I'm going to give myself more time that the battery is going to work. So it's discharging at a slower rate. And if I don't need certain electronics, I could turn those off too. So if I have my ADF on, you can see I turn my ADF on, and let me see if I can get these both in the picture for you. But as I turn that off on my amp meter, you can see, okay, so I turn ADF off and my amp meter goes up a little bit. So I'm discharging a little slower. I have a little bit more battery time, and that just gives me more options to get to the airport. So again, shed non-required electrical equipment, and then just terminate your flight as soon as possible. This is a really good example of whether or not to declare an emergency. Assuming there was nothing else going on, just the alternator failed, I probably wouldn't declare an emergency because I don't feel that the outcome of the flight is in doubt. I still have a functioning engine. I still have radio communications. I can let ATC know what's going on, and just give them a heads up that I may be coming in without a radio if my electrical system fails. But in general, I know that I have options, and it's the outcome of the flight isn't in doubt. It's just that I may not have electricity when I land, and so I'd want to communicate that with ATC. If the ammeter shows an excess rate of charge, and actually we can look at that right here. So I'm gonna again start this engine. I'm gonna do the old Control E sim cheat start, but that's all right. And one thing that shows up on here right away is this ammeter or indication is a lot of charge. So I've said this every time we go out and check it. It's like, if I saw this in the plane, that seems like excess charge to me. So our low volts has gone off, but our ammeter seems like it's charging way more than it should. In that case, I'd remove the alternator from the system because I don't want to overcharge the battery. And then again, same sort of thing as we just talked about, which is as soon as you remove that ammeter, you're on only battery, and so you want to remove electrical equipment and try and conserve as much energy as you can. So. They say full scale deflection is the excess rate of charge, so that would be, we use the POH for our reference, so POH says full scale deflection, so that's what we'll say it is. Oops, we got the engines running real hot here. Okay, so the only other one to know about would be a full electrical system failure. So let's say that something happens and everything just goes off. In that case, now you're starting to come in Nordo, so that's no radio. You know what? I don't have radio on here. Actually, we should talk about that as its own thing. So Nordo, or no radio, essentially means that for whatever reason, either your radio stopped working or your electrical system failed, means that you're coming in without a radio. If you had something where just your comm system failed, you would squawk 7600. Do this. And so that communicates with your transponder that you don't have a radio, and it's emergency going on, essentially. So you don't have a way to communicate with ATC, but you want them to know who you are and that you don't have a radio, so that they know what to expect you're going to do. And what they're going to expect you're going to do is come into land, probably at the nearest airport, but if you're near your home airport, maybe at your home airport, they'll expect you to circle the field 500 feet above the traffic pattern altitude. They'll eventually get the light gun out, probably really quickly. They'll clear the other traffic from the area and light gun you into the ground so that you can get on the ground and fix whatever the problem is. So that's that 7600 squawk code, is about Nordo, no radio. It may also be the case that you end up in a situation where the whole electrical system fails for whatever reason, in which case then, again, you can declare the emergency at the flight deck, fly in, circle, you'll get the light guns to land. If they see an aircraft coming in that's not squawking, not doing anything, they're going to assume that there's some sort of emergency going on, and they're going to help you get on the ground. Okay, so that's Nordo. If you're in a situation where you think the radio isn't working for some reason, one really common one that happens is folks will think that they can't hear anything on the radio, and so they go, oh no one can hear me. So you want to make sure you check your volume. That's a really common kind of mistake where people forget to check. You can do that by on this one, I believe you push it in, but it says, yeah, push for squelch. Essentially what that'll do is you can push it in, it'll give you this kind of static, and then you can tune the volume of the static and then turn it off. In turning off the squelch, or turning on the squelch, I think, then it removes that static so you don't just hear it in your headset. But if you want to put it in so you can get the volume right, that's one thing to do. You also want to check, like, sometimes this microphone, if it like fell between the seats, it might be that the button is getting pushed, and so you're actually transmitting the whole time, which is why you can't hear anything, is because you're constantly transmitting. I had someone I know who had that happen to them. Or it may be that your radio button isn't working or your headset's unplugged, so double check that that's all plugged in. A little bit of debugging about the radio just to see what's going on before you declare it a radio emergency. All right, next one here is minimum fuel. So shut this plane off again. Oh, I turned off the avionics after the master, so that was bad practice. So you want to do avionics first, then master. Okay, so minimum fuel. So we talked about fuel requirements, fuel planning. It may be the case that despite having planned for reserve and despite planning and having enough fuel for everything, something occurs that causes you to go around. Maybe there's unexpected weather in your way, you have to go around it. You can let ATC know that you have minimum fuel as a way of, it's not saying that there is an emergency, but it's telling them that if you're further delayed, then it could turn into an emergency. So you probably want to do that when you're starting to get, there's some debate on if it should be when you are getting to your reserves versus when you're getting to the point. Anyway, to give it a little bit more clear answer, if you want ATC to know that further delays would put you in a situation where the outcome of the flight is in doubt and therefore it becomes an emergency, then you want to let them know you have minimum fuel. So just a way of communicating that you're not out of fuel, it's not an emergency yet, but it could develop into emergency if they don't take you seriously. Flap failure actually is in the POH here, and so let's look at what that one is. Let me make sure. I was looking at this earlier. Oh, you know what? Let me see if I can find it real quick. For whatever reason, I can't search this POH, which is really funny to me because I can search this one that's like a scan. Okay, let's see if I can find no flaps. Essentially, with a no flap landing, you want to, because you aren't using flaps, that means that your stall speed is higher, and so you're going to need to come in with more airspeed than normal. Yeah, I talk about with this. Yeah, I can't remember if they talk about no flap landing in the POH specifically. For some reason, I remember them doing that, and usually that means that I'm thinking of a different aircraft's POH. So, but regardless, the general approach is the same, which is that you're going to come in with enough airspeed that realize this engine is running. Let me see how that. It's really quiet. Great. But you're going to come in with enough airspeed that you are well above your stalling speed. And so for icing, they recommend let's look at the icing section we'll talk about in just a moment. But they recommend, I think it's like 70 on final or something like that. You notice that they have actually a lot more things that they talk about. For instance, low oil pressure. We should talk about this. So you want to read through all of these because it'll have information about what to do with like spark plug following, magneto malfunction, all things that you should know. Okay. At any rate, so for a no flap landing, you're coming in with more airspeed because your stall speed is going to be higher, and then you're expecting to float, so you don't have that drag. Here we go, inadvertent icing encounter. So they're saying not 65 to 75 for icing. Partially, you're coming in with no flaps. Also, you're coming in with potential ice, which increases your stall speed. We'll talk about in a second. But you want to carry in more power, more air speed so that you don't stall on final, but also not so much that you're going to float forever down the runway. So that's a flap failure. Remember, the electrical system also controls the flaps in a Cessna, so if you have an electrical failure, it means you're going to have a flap failure. You should practice doing no flap landings periodically because you want to know how that feels and how it's different as you approach. The mechanics are all basically the same. You're choosing your aiming point, you're holding your airspeeds judiciously so that you're not getting too slow, and then you're round out, flare, touchdown, all that kind of stuff. But you're just more likely to float because you don't have that drag. Retractable gear malfunction. We don't have retractable gear in this aircraft, but if you did have a retractable gear malfunction, essentially first there's a couple steps you can use to try and debug it. If you are not able to, you want to touch down on your good tires first. So if you have a main gear that doesn't extend, this also applies to flat tires. So you want to touch down on the good tires first. If it's a main wheel or nose wheel that won't extend, then you land on your two mains, slowly come down, and then let the nose at the slowest possible speed scrape against the ground. If you can't get any of your gear down, then you'd have to do a landing on just the belly of the plane. Again, same sort of thing. You want to have as little energy in that equation as possible. You also might want to circle for a while to get rid of some fuel because you don't want to have a bunch of fuel in that equation either. And definitely let the tower know what you need to do. So you declare an emergency for sure. So that they're ready with, for instance, fire trucks or other things like that, just to have some precautions in place. If you have a door open in flight, it's actually not that big a deal. It seems like a big deal because it could be kind of loud, but the airflow over the aircraft here keeps the door kind of pushed shut. So if you did have a door open in flight, it would just sort of get pushed against the side of the fuselage, and really not that big a deal. You can just come into land at your nearest airport and close the door. You can also try to close it in flight depending on the door. Yeah, you can close it in flight for certain kinds of aircraft. So I think a 172 you probably could. All right, low oil pressure is another one. I also realized that we talked about some other indications here. We didn't talk about low vacuum pressure. We're going to talk about that when we get to vacuum systems. So really we've talked about the ammeter. EGT, if your engine starts to run hot, that can be a problem. In a trainer plane like this, that's less likely to happen. But you may want to cool it by getting more airflow over the engine. So, if you're climbing at VX at your maximum rate of climb, you might want to pitch the nose down a little bit. But let's talk about oil temperature, oil pressure. So if you lose oil pressure, one thing is you're going to get a indication up here. Just turn on my battery. You're going to get an indication up here that says oil pressure, that one up here. And the loss of oil pressure means that there's not oil flowing through the engine, which means that the engine is almost certainly going to seize any moment. So as soon as there's no oil flowing through it, it is just metal on metal. Metal on metal then gets hot quickly, and that will melt together, and then your engine will just quit. So if you lose oil, if you don't develop oil pressure when you first start the engine, that's a sign that you don't want to go flying. So this is, if you remember from our start checklist, the first thing we do is after we start the engine, as soon as it catches, we're looking at the oil pressure, make sure the oil pressure is rising. If the oil pressure doesn't come up in the green before 30 seconds, then you want to quit the engine because it's almost certainly going to destroy the engine if it keeps running. If you lose oil pressure in flight, then you should assume that you're going to lose your engine at any moment and essentially start your ABCDEs. You still have power, so that's good. So you can continue flying to try and get your best possible situation, but you should be anticipating the engine's going to quit any moment. Oil temperature can similarly be a problem. You want it to stay in the green. If it gets too hot, again, you can do that engine cooling where you tip the engine, maybe operate the engine at a lower power setting. Oops, I'm not even showing what I'm pointing to over here. Sorry about that. So like the oil pressure has a green range. I've mentioned a couple of times that the sim has this starting below the green range when you start the engine up. I don't love that. If we brought in more power here, so I'm bringing up the engine, you can see it comes into the green. So yeah, but anyway, it should be in the green when you're operating the aircraft. And then temperature should also stay in the green. You don't want that to get too hot either. All right, so there's a couple of key failures to know about. You should definitely read the emergency procedures chapter in here. I think we've already had that as homework once, but you want to make sure you understand all of that and understand how the different failures and solutions relate to the systems in the aircraft. So, all right, so talked about fire, talked about failure. Let's talk about some unsafe conditions. And I know we have about 15 minutes left. I think we're still doing pretty good on time. One of them is VFR into IMC. So as VFR pilots, as a private pilot, you are being trained to fly with reference to the horizon. And so everything that we talk about is setting up for an ability to fly when you can see that horizon line. The reason that we do a specific training for instrument flying is that the procedures we use for instrument flying allow you to use the instruments on your dashboard, on your flight deck to replace that horizon. So specifically the attitude indicator is a key one for that. So you can think of the attitude indicator as the wings of the plane reference to the horizon here, and you essentially fly looking at this and then cross-checking your other instruments. It's something for an instrument course, we don't need to talk about that much more here, but the important thing is our goal is to avoid flight into IMC as VFR pilots. Full stop. We want to avoid flight into IMC. Flight into IMC is one of the most dangerous things that occurs to VFR pilots because you don't have the training for how to handle it. And so the mistakes that you make, which you would have learned during instrument training how to avoid, you just don't know. And so you make simple mistakes that then put you in positions where you can crash into a mountain or end up upside down by accident or other things like that. So this is a really serious topic, this VFR into IMC. I realize you can't see my notes here, but I've moved on to this guy here. So that's VFR into IMC. Let's talk a little bit about what happens if you do end up flying into IMC for some reason. Again, number one goal is to not put yourself in a situation where you would need to fly out of IMC. You want to avoid it full stop. But if you did end up flying into IMC, the basic approach is if you just came from VMC, if you just came from visual meteorological conditions, IMC is instrument meteorological conditions, so instrument flying. If you just came from VMC, probably 180-degree turn and flying back the way you came is going to get you back to VMC. So as a private pilot, we do a certain amount of training on VFR into IMC just so that you can get yourself out of it. But the training is intended to get you turned 180 degrees around and then back out of IMC. It is not about flying through the clouds. That's a whole other rating that is a great rating to work on, but that's not the goal here. So let's look at what they have to say in the POH, which I think is in the expanded sections, actually. Yeah. Oh, that's icing. Yeah, emergency operations in the clouds. This is in reference to having a total vacuum failure in the clouds, which is more of a thing that so that would mean that you've flown into clouds and you've had a vacuum failure. So this may not be as useful, but we can talk about it because this is the same basic procedure you would use. So essentially what you're doing to turn around in the clouds is you're going to be looking at your altitude here and make sure your altitude holds constant, and then you're going to use your turn coordinator and execute a standard rate turn. So if we go up flying, and actually we can do this real quick. Let me see if I can get they talk a little bit about. Okay, so let's look at this at least for here. So what we're going to do is we'll go up and I'm going to jump up into the sky here. I think I have the aircraft already turning, so this should be fine. And I want to show you how that turn coordinator works. Now, part of the training of being a private pilot is 3 hours of hood time. And hood time means that you're flying only based on the instruments, essentially being given directions from your CFI on what altitude to hold, what direction to go, and that sort of thing. So again, the extent of the training is just to get you to the point where you could turn around in the clouds. It's not meant to teach you how to fly through the clouds, but it is meant to teach you how to get out of a sticky situation. So let's get to 3,200 here. And first thing we want to do, so we've flown into a cloud, we can't see what's going on in front of us. And so the first thing we want to do is note our heading so that we know when we're turned around. You could bug it up if you wanted to, you can memorize it. Bugging it up is usually a good idea. If you can record it somewhere, then you don't have to think about it. Okay, so that's the first thing that we're doing. The next thing that we're doing, noting our altitudes. We want to hold our altitude and turn away from the clouds. So we're going to do a standard rate turn here. Standard rate turn means that we have the aircraft indicator here, this turn coordinator, has the wing pointed at that first line here. And you can see on this, it says this 2 minutes thing. So 2 minutes means that if you held that turn at a standard rate, if you held the wing pointed at that for the airspeed you're going, it would take you 2 minutes to do a 360. That also means that if you hold it for 1 minute, you'll go 180 degrees. So at this point then, you can start counting if you want. If you have a timer, you could use a timer. You actually have one up here if you're really proficient at it. But just counting it out is also okay. You also have the heading bugged up, so you have another reference. But standard rate turn, 60 seconds, that gets you 180 degrees. Also turning to opposite this heading. So again, we'll keep flying through this maneuver. Oops. Go like that. Okay, so I'm holding that standard rate turn. I'm looking at my standard rate turn, looking at my altitude, making sure that I'm continuing to turn without losing altitude. You notice that this is like a 15-degree bank, so it's really not that much. And you also can see that I'm holding to the horizon here, so it's the same thing I see outside. You might be counting this down. You might have started a timer, but you're also looking at your attitude indicator. And the whole goal, again, is just to turn 180 degrees. So there's nothing else that you're really trying to do but just get back to where VMC was. Right. And then as we come to here, at this point, we may have flown into the cloud for a little bit. And so what we're doing is we're going to roll out on the opposite heading. Again, watching our altitude, and then we're just holding this altitude and the opposite direction and flying back out of IMC. This is one of those ones that is, it's part of the standard training. It's a really important thing to do with your instructor. It is really hard to do in the sim because the whole point of it is for you to have the hood on, to not be able to see outside, to experience what it's like. It's like I could turn on clouds in the sim, but it's still not going to be all that useful, I don't think. So we won't dwell on it much longer. The important thing is if you fly into IMC, the goal is to turn back around, go the other way out. You're not trying to fly in it. Okay. Go like that. The next one on here is icing, and we can actually show a little bit of what this looks like in the sim, but the important thing with icing is you want to avoid it. Just like VFR and IMC, these are things that we're trying to avoid full stop. So if I load up, let's go for some icing conditions here. And so icing conditions, in order to get icing on the aircraft, you need clouds that you're flying through, and you need below freezing air temperatures. So visible moisture and below freezing temperatures. And so you may encounter that if you're flying through the rain. So as VFR pilots, we're allowed to fly through the rain. We can still see the horizon. If you're flying through the clouds, obviously you have a different problem. As a VFR pilot, you shouldn't be doing that anyway. But if for some reason you did end up in a situation where you got ice accumulation, the important thing to know is that ice very quickly changes the aerodynamic characteristics of your wing. And so in having ice along the wing, that's going to increase your stall speed. It'll increase the drag on the aircraft. It could make the plane uncontrollable in unusual ways. And a really important one is that it may make it so that your increase of flaps, because the stall speed could be so much higher with these weird aerodynamic characteristics, if you added flaps as you're coming into land, you may stall at really high airspeeds. So we typically, coming into land with ice, we would land no flaps, trying to fly the airspeed that has kept the plane flying without changing anything last minute that might cause us to just fall from the sky. In the sim, we can actually see what icing looks like. So why don't we pop up to the overcast layer here. We can drop the temperature. So I think that'll work. And let's bring this temperature down to minus 60. So the most, what is this? Degrees Fahrenheit? Oh, that's interesting. I guess we can use degrees Fahrenheit. So the most likely icing conditions are actually just below freezing. If it gets really, really cold, the icing isn't necessarily as big a concern. This is a whole other topic, but so we'll go just below freezing here, and let's see if I can get the amount of icing buildup. Probably not, to be honest. 5 degrees Fahrenheit, yeah. Well, I know it's possible in the sim. I won't belabor it too much because essentially what I was going to show you is what it looks like. But what you would see is you'd start to see some buildup probably on the strut. You might see little bits on the window, so we're actually seeing a little bit come in here. In a different kind of airplane, you can see the front leading edge of the wing, and you might see it there. But as soon as you see this sort of thing, one, we're in the clouds, so we shouldn't be doing that. But also then we want to get out of icy conditions. So we don't want ice accumulation, and the risk there is pretty great. All right. Let's finish off here with clicking on my wrong thing here. Okay. Emergency equipment survival gear, and then some squawk codes. So when you're flying out, especially if you're going to be flying over like large patches of wilderness or the mountains, you want to be considerate about the emergency equipment you have on board in case you had to make an emergency landing, especially somewhere further from civilization. One thing to think about is you probably want to plan your flight so that if at any point along that flight you did lose your engine, you have good options. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you can't recover from an emergency. But included in that preparation may be, yes, I'm near enough civilization, but I want to be ready for, needing to spend a night outdoors if I had to, or things like that. Bringing emergency clothing if you're going to be flying in colder areas, food, shelter, that sort of thing. We don't talk much more about this if you do like mountain flying or you're going to go on a trip bigger that takes you in those sorts of areas. You definitely want to talk with a CFI and make sure that you have the proper equipment there, and they can walk you through a bunch of the things you should consider. This comes down to that same sort of philosophy of plan for what could go wrong, don't plan for everything to go right. So yeah, the cabin gets nice and toasty when the engine's running and you got the heat on and all that kind of stuff. But if you lose your engine and you're now landing in 40-degree temperatures out in the woods, you want to have a plan for what you're going to do for that. One thing you might also consider, although your aircraft has an ELT, this is an emergency locator transmitter. Let me make sure I get that acronym right. I'll do that for tomorrow or Monday. Essentially, if the ELT detects that you've been in a crash, it'll start to transmit a information about where the aircraft is. Either it'll just put out general information, or more modern ones will include like a GPS location. You can activate that manually if you know that you're going to be in a situation where you want that information broadcast. That would be on this one. If I put it to on, then it would activate. Otherwise, it's armed, means that it would activate on contact. Oops, I didn't switch to the sim. You can't see what I was doing. So that's this guy right over here. So you could put it to on, would turn it to on, but if I put it to armed, which it is currently, then that means it would activate on impact. You can also get a PLB, a personal locator beacon. So that would be sort of like a handheld thing that you could then activate on your own. Just another kind of safety piece of equipment. A couple emergency squawk codes we've already talked about. 7700. 7700 is what you squawk in a distress or urgency condition. Like I mentioned yesterday, the radar facilities are equipped so that if they see 7700 as a squawk code, that then kicks off alarms and a bunch of other immediate things within the facility. So that'll get you attention, assistance, help, all that kind of stuff. The other next squawk code to know is this 7600. So that's a Nordo squawk code. That means you don't have a radio, you lost two-way communication. Talked about that one before. And the last one to know is 7500. So this is a hijacking squawk code. So the idea behind this is if you had someone come up in the flight deck and they were going to steal the plane for malicious intent, whatever it might be. That person may understand enough about the plane that if you got on the radio and said, I'm being hijacked, I need help, they're going to know that you just did that and it's going to escalate the situation. But they may not know enough about the aircraft that you could plug in 7500 on the transponder, and they may not think anything of it because it's just a random number. And so the idea is that 7500 becomes this secondary way of communicating if there's a hijacking going on. There have been stories of ATC suspecting a hijacking for any number of reasons. Just for the record, very few stories, but still stories about this. And they may say something like verify 7500. You should refuse to squawk it if you're not being hijacked. So if you accidentally squawk it and they say confirm, that's one kind of problem. But if they tell you to squawk it and you're not being hijacked, you want to deny it. Otherwise, there's a story that I linked to here where an aircraft on 9/11 they thought was hijacked as well. And so they told them to squawk 7500 and the pilot went, okay, I'll squawk that. And it's like, well, that was your out to communicate that you're not being hijacked, but now we think you are being hijacked. So even if you pass through one of these codes, it'll trigger an alert for ATC. So when you set a squawk code, be mindful not to pass through it accidentally. This is like quintessential sort of like you'll catch yourself doing it one time and you'll go, oh no, I almost hit the button that would have made this an emergency squawk code. Especially because our 1200 squawk is also a 00 ending. If you get a squawk code that's similar to a 7700 and you accidentally hit 7 or anything else, if you pass through it for even a moment, that kicks off all those same alarm bells. So you just get a bunch of radio calls and they try and figure out what's going on. But yeah, you don't want to accidentally pass through it either. A couple common errors: failure to use flow patterns or memory items. Remember that Cessna POH has those bolded items that we should memorize. So that's part of the homework is to memorize those. But a common error would be failure to use that flow pattern or the memory items. Failure to use checklists or improper use of checklists. So after we do our flow pattern, then we pull out our checklist and we confirm that we've done everything we need to do, but also that anything else that's beyond the memory items. Completion standards: client demonstrates appropriate knowledge of aircraft systems, abnormal and emergency procedures, and ability to perform emergency procedures to ACS standards. Required homework: memorize those emergency flows. Like I said, I liked renting an aircraft. I like to rent an aircraft and sit in the aircraft and practice them. You don't have to spin the propeller, so you're not costing any money depending on how the club is set up. But it's really nice to actually get in there. The flight sim works pretty well too. You can do for certain aircraft, again, if the aircraft is well modeled in the sim. And chair fly all the emergencies in the POH. So you want to practice those emergency flows, but you also want to go through every single situation in the POH and make sure you understand what you would do to respond to that situation. All right, we're finishing right on time here. My program manager background is very happy. Is there any last minute questions before we close out? Take another drink of water here. All right, we got one no, thank you. Sounds good. Well, thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the questions and the input and stories. Really appreciate it. And I will see you all on Monday for pre-solo knowledge, which will also be a little bit of a catch-all sort of thing. So it should be sort of a fun potpourri. Whereas with a student, it's a little bit more like real paperwork. We'll just talk about the idea of the paperwork. So, all right, have a good weekend. Bye.